Oh, applesauce. It isn't fair. Nobody understands. It's hard to be a modest girl in an immodest culture, you know? I want to be modern and glamorous like Josephine. Josephine from school came over and she said that there's a speakeasy in town. You know, that's those juice joints where the gangsters and the flappers do the Charleston and the Lindy Hop and they drink illegal liquor, at least till the coppers come and bust the joint. Well, she wanted to go and look in the window and see if we could see a real gangster. Well, I wanted to go and hear the new jazz music because I hear it's just the cat's pajamas. Mom said I couldn't go. She said the Bible says that you shouldn't follow crowds do evil. I told her I wanted to look like Josephine because her mom lets her do whatever she wants. But my mom won't let me shorten my skirts. She won't let me roll my stockings down around my ankles. She won't let me wear makeup, and she definitely won't let me bob my hair and crimp it. I told her I didn't want to be a flapper. I just wanted to look like a flapper. But she said that the Bible said, abstain from all appearance of evil. Well, I'm ashamed of it now, but I said some pretty disrespectful things, and then I ran out of the house. Because I thought if I hurried, maybe I could catch up with Josephine before she scrammed from that place. On my way, I stopped at the nickel and dime store, and I traded my hat for a tube of lipstick and a pair of scissors. Not working. Do you have any tape? I'm gonna look more. Okay. They don't see me that close through the window. It's okay. All right. All right. Okay. How do you get it out? Why is it pointing like that? You're supposed to get it on. Do I look glamorous? Can I borrow your mirror? Oh, applesauce. Aww. Well, right then, I heard a scream. Sounded like Josephine. So I ran to the next street over. And sure enough, there she was with 4 guys. And the guys were weird. It was like they were laughing and they were talking real Murray. And they couldn't stand up straight. I've never seen anybody who's drunk before, but if that's what drunk looks like, it's not glamorous at all. They just look really stupid. Well, the one guy had grabbed Josephine, and he said she had to come back inside and dance with him before he let her go. And she was screaming and screaming, and then he said he wouldn't let her go till she kissed him. Well, that was just too much. So I looked around, and there was some trash on the side of the road. It was a pretty trashy road. And there was an empty beer bottle. So I picked up the beer bottle, and I ran up, and I crashed it on that guy's head. Well, wouldn't you know it, he just, dropped to the ground and moaned and rolled over and threw up all over Josephine's shoes. Well, all I had was a broken bottle left, and there were 3 guys left. So I threw it at him, and I grabbed Josephine, and we went running and running and running and running and running until we sure they weren't coming after us. So then we stopped on the side of the road to catch our breath. And Josephine, she started sobbing. And sobbing and sobbing. She's kind of dramatic. She was sobbing and she said she never should have gone in there and she wished she hadn't cut her hair. She actually went inside. And she said the music really was the cat's pajamas. It was peachy keen. But the place was full of smoke, and everybody was drinking and like gambling and stuff, and it wasn't a fun place at all. Some people had passed out on the floor, and they were doing some other stuff she wouldn't tell me about, but she decided this is not the place for her, and so that's when she left, and those guys followed her, and they wanted to dance with her, and she just said it was miserable and terrible, and she couldn't believe blah, 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 and on and on and on, and she was crying so much that her makeup was just dripping down her face in these big lines and dripping on her dress. She didn't look glamorous anymore either. And then she said, I wish I was brave like you. I said, you mean like the bottle? I didn't hit him that hard. I think he was a wimp. And she said, no. Brave enough to be different. She said, you have enough courage to not do things that you know are wrong just to make people like you. Well, I thought about that all the way till we got to Josephine's house. And I thought about it while I cleaned the throw up off of Josephine's shoes. And I thought about it as I kept walking home. I never thought of different as being brave. I always thought of it as being kind of embarrassing. But the more I thought about it, the more I thought, the people who make a difference are usually different. They're not like everybody else. So maybe it is brave to be different. Maybe I should think about it differently. I'm not really sure how to do it, but I should ask my mom about it. Ooh. After I apologize. Well, I can see my house, so I need to go. So, I'll catch you cats and dogs later. Oh, wait, I'm going to be different. So, bye. Be different. Ah. Okay. Got my hat back. Thank you very much. The Roaring 20s. Now, if you've ever heard of the 20s, if ever there's a decade in the 20th century that you can recognize pretty much just like that from a picture, from the music, it's the 20s. And there's a reason for that. It was a party decade and a very, very distinct decade. It was a decade of great wealth and great indulgence. So, we had the Great War. You remember last decade was full of all these big tragedies, all these terrible, large-scale, bad things happening. So the people who had survived, wow. Can you turn that back on, Daniel? I look like I don't exist. Thanks. So if you had survived the war, and then you had survived the pandemic, you probably had lost a lot of people, and kind of like the American people were just in this sort of, I'm so sick of all this bad stuff, I just want to forget about it, I just want to go have fun, kind of that eat, drink, and be merry kind of attitude. And so that's what they did, and they partied hard. And they had money to party with. America got pretty rich from the war, as was mentioned last week from our guest speaker. America didn't fight the war on its land, so we made a bunch of money by producing things that were needed for the war, but we didn't have to rebuild. So the money jumped up significantly. In fact, can anybody remember what the average wage was last decade?
It was like 750.
It was around 750. So before that, it was, I think, around 400. So it hadn't jumped up that much from one decade to the next. But this decade, we are starting with a pointer that doesn't work. Real? No. All right. So this decade, we're starting with a wage of $1,400 a year. So that's almost double. People have spending money, some of them for the first time in their lives, and there's new inventions that make life easier for them, so they don't have to spend as much time doing basic things like cooking and cleaning, things like that. So they've got some time to have fun. Oh, goodness. Wow. I'm too young to wear makeup. Okay. So they did. They spent a lot of money. But you'll notice that the price of things went up as well. So a bicycle, if you wanted to buy one in 1900, it was $17. In 1910, it was $12. It was actually cheaper. But then in 1920, it jumped way up to $43. So prices were bigger, so we needed more money because of inflation, but not that much money. Population was up to 106 million. Does anybody remember what it was last decade? At the beginning of the decade? Those are tough numbers to remember. It was 93. And I believe the decade before it was about 63. So it just keeps climbing and climbing with people immigrating from around the world Who wants the American dream? This picture kind of represents the 20s. It was basically people doing risky, somewhat stupid stuff. Kind of this, oh, well, we might die anyway kind of thought. Yeah, okay. The clothing of the time, this was the flapper decade. Now, not everybody was a flapper. That tended to be the younger girls in late teens, early 20s. There was no such thing as a teenager at this time. But this was the fashion of the time. And you'll notice, still a lot of people had the long ones, but the modesty standards went crazy. So whereas your average, say, Christian family might still be wearing something like I'm wearing, something like maybe like this, the flappers made this huge change. Now, if you look at decades, often modesty standards change a little tiny bit, little by little tiny bit per decade. They'll go up, like say in the 1900s, the skirt was down at the floor. And then by 1910, it was up at the ankles. Ooh, so like 2 inches. And now all of a sudden, these young girls are like, forget this, we're going to do our own thing. Their skirts went way up to their knees, which was horribly scandalous. Some of them were sleeveless, which was scandalous. The whole thing was scandalous. And they cut their hair and they wore makeup, and it was a kind of rebellion, actually. The flapper girls was a segment of society that was like, we're throwing off the rules, we're doing our own thing. Girls started smoking, they started going to parties. Yeah. Another thing that happened in the 20s was the rising up of jazz music. And I actually really love jazz music. As you'll notice, it tended to be the African American population that was doing the jazz music. And we're really good at it. Later, we're going to talk about a guy named Louis Armstrong, who's one of the most famous trumpet players in the world. Babe Ruth. Other things that happened in this decade. He was the great baseball player, and you can study about him if you're interested in baseball. But if you notice, he doesn't look like our ideal of a sports hero person. He's not like super fit and trim. That wasn't really the thing back then. It's like you had your own life, but then if you played baseball, you could hit balls really well. I mean, you notice, look at his pants. It's almost like he's got a rubber band around his pants to hold him in. So it's not like they even had, uniforms, stuff like that. Sort of uniform. But like the white socks used to be the white stockings. Yeah, sometimes. Anybody know who this guy is? Charles Lindbergh, super famous because he made the first solo trip across the Atlantic. It was a very, very big deal. It was all over the news. He was like superhero status, movie star status. It ended up being very tragic for him being famous. But for a while there, he got to live in the sun. This is Houdini, the great Houdini. He was famous for putting himself in these really weird situations that you put like in a locked, box, and they throw him in the ocean, and nobody else, nobody could survive this, and he would somehow survive, and he would put himself in chains and all this weird stuff. It was a kind of a time of lots of weird, circusy type stuff. Basically, get attention, get money that way. People want to see entertainment, and so anything you can do that's entertaining, sure. This is not. The suffrage movement was also a big deal. We'll get there. 1920 was when all those suffragists who'd been picketing for all those years got what they wanted. 1920, women were given the right to vote. Now, those of you that have a worksheet in front of you, which should be everybody, first I want you to write your name on it, make sure you have. And then next to your name, I want you to write a yes or no. Do you think women should have the right to vote or not? And then later this week, if you want, you can give me your reasons why for a little bit of extra credit. I'd be curious about it. And particularly if you can give me a Bible verse to support your opinion, that would give me even more. So, this is the newspaper at the time. Suffrage wins. And so now women have the right to vote. So now women have more power in what happens in our country. And that is significant. Books of the time, Winnie the Pooh was first started. Didn't look quite like he does in Disney. And Dr. Dolittle. Guess it was an animal theme back then. So the music of the time, the Swanee River, way down upon the Swanee River. or Old Man River, which is a beautiful song from the play Showboat, or We Have No Bananas. If you haven't heard that one, yes, we have no bananas. I don't know, it's a weird song. We have no bananas today. I don't know what the point of it is, but it became kind of famous in, I believe, World War II when the rations were short and they didn't have any bananas. There's a song. Okay, now we're on to the movies. If you were here before class started, I showed a silent movie with one of the most famous silent movie stars, Buster Keaton, who would do all these stunts. And there was no special effects. There were no stunt guys. It was just him. It's pretty amazing. These are silent films. And the silent film age, one thing that was cool, you can find silent films on YouTube. There's Charlie Chaplin, Mickey Mouse, and Steamboat Willie. That was the first Mickey Mouse cartoon. Ben-Hur. You notice the excessive makeup. That was because it's all black and white. And so to get the shadows and everything, they all had to wear like tons of makeup. And you'll see they actually did a chariot scene. And here's, you know, the car that's got the camera, and they're running by the chariot. It's pretty impressive what they were able to do in the 20s. But the way that silent films worked was, here's all this stuff going on, but there's no sound, because film couldn't do that at that point. And so they would have a piano or a pipe organ in the theater, and you'd pay like a nickel or a dime to go see a movie, and somebody's job would be to sit there and play music to go with what was going on in the movie. And so if it's a suspenseful part, you know, and if it's a really romantic part, la-di-da-di-da-di-da-di-da, and that was their job, was to basically improvise and make up stuff to go with what was going on in the movie. It'd be a fun job if you're a really good musician. And then this happened. 1927 was the very first talkie. What that means is the very first movie where it had sound along with the movie. It was a huge, big deal. If you want to kind of study the history a little bit, watch the movie Singing in the Rain, which is with Gene Kelly and I just forgot her name, went blank. But this one was controversial, as you can see. This was called The Jazz Singer, and it was a guy who put himself in blackface and sang, I haven't seen the movie, but basically this was the intro to all of the movies that we see today, because we don't watch silent movies anymore. But there was a thing back then, there was still a lot of prejudice, there was still a lot of segregation between the white people and the black people. And so in the movie industry, or even in vaudeville and other performing type things, you notice you had the band that was full of the black people, and then you have the groups over here that was full of the white people. So if you were going to have a white people vaudeville show, but they wanted to sing a Negro spiritual, they would cover their faces in like black paint and do this kind of mimicking of a black person, which at this point now is considered very disrespectful. At the time, it probably was considered disrespectful too, but at this time they were segregated, so they probably didn't know or didn't care. One or the other. All right, inventions and new stuff. Here we go. The Baker's Candy Bar, named after Babe Ruth. The washing machine. So instead of washing things on that little board, and then having to beat them on something, having to wring them out, you could use this wondrous invention. This is the grandest washer the world has ever known. So easy to run that it's almost fun to work it. Yeah. And you can even get a free trial. That's impressive. So things like this are in Free's catalog back there. The advertisements, the pictures, the new things, they would have to explain them to tell people what they actually are. It's like, what is that thing? The refrigerator was invented, which tells you all of history before this point. People didn't have refrigerators. Wowzers. Took a lot more work. Yay, the vacuum cleaner! And look at that, you can buy it for your wife for Christmas and she's going to love you forever. At the time, she probably would, because it was in for a lot of work. The first Harley Davidson looks a little different than it does now. The dude on it looks a little different than they do now. It doesn't look like your typical Harley guy. Speed and comfort. Kool-Aid. Tomato soup. The radio. The radio is significant, very significant. Because imagine at this time, you've got families, they've got no TV, no internet, nothing like that. So if you want to get together as a family and spend time together, maybe you'll play a game, maybe you'll read a book together. but there's no entertainment that's like coming from the outside in a sense. The radio happens. And it was so significant that between 1922 and 1930, the number of families that had a radio, it was 60,000, and by the end of the decade, it was 13 million. I mean, this thing was huge. And it's interesting to study because they had the problem with the radio that they had when they got TV, that we've had when we got the internet. There's nothing new under the sun. People were super worried about, oh, these programs, some of them are trashy, and we're getting into American homes, and this isn't good. But the problem was the people were making the programs based on what the advertisers wanted rather than what was good and right. Have you ever heard of a soap opera? Anybody know why it's a soap opera? Because everybody uses soap? I mean, we hope so. Now that is a good one. These soap operas originally started on radio, and they were called soap operas or soaps because it was the soap companies that sponsored them and that did the advertisements throughout this program. So it was a soap program. They didn't talk about soap in the program, but the commercials were soap. Now, these soap operas were usually geared toward the American housewife who was at home during the day cleaning or using her new vacuum cleaner or her new weird washing machine. And so it was all about relationships and drama and who would run off with who and, you know, all the scandalous things that are still on soap operas. They go on and on and on and on and on. And it was effective. But there were people who were saying, this is terrible for the American people. Some of these programs are no good, and we need to have better programs. We need to educate people. We need to help people become better, et cetera, et cetera. But the money wins out. Interestingly enough, the public broadcasting system was created. I don't think we've gotten here yet, so I'll wait on that one. Sliced bread! Dun, dun, dun! Have you ever heard this is the best days when sliced bread? Well, this is when it happened. Before then, you had big loaves, and you had to slice it. It was real crummy, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. This man made a machine that would slice the bread, and it was apparently life-changing because people still talk about it. Okay. All right, let's delve into politics of the 1920s. There are 3 elections in the 1920s, 3 presidents. They are all Republican, but that may not mean what you think it means. Okay. First guy was in the 1920 election, from Woodrow Wilson to him. Now, you remember Woodrow Wilson got in on the he'll keep us out of the war, and then he got us into the war. So by 1920, people are sick of this whole thing, and they're like, no, we want to go back to normal. We're done with this. And so that's why they got this guy in, who apparently wasn't really meant to be a president, but he seemed like a nice guy. So there was a teapot scandal, if you want to look into that. It was about corruption in high places. Oh, just so you know, this is the projector that keeps going in and out. I don't actually have a bunch of blue slides to show you. He died. He was not assassinated, he just died. And that was about 2 years in. You can look up what he died from. But it didn't have anything to do with politics. Calvin Coolidge was next. He was the business of America is business. Well, that sounds like a slogan for today. So it was about businesses being powerful, and that was going to help the economy, and that's going to make things better. And hey, we've got lots of money, so let's build business, and business is going to, that whole thing. We've heard it all in campaigns. So he didn't want to help the farmers. He wanted to help the city businessmen. Interesting.
Was he a businessman?
Good question. Well, he was a president. It'd be interesting what he was before that. Herbert Hoover. So this guy's a millionaire. He basically won because he was running against a Catholic, and people didn't like that, so they voted for him just because he wasn't a Catholic. He wanted to have prosperity and eliminate poverty. That's a great idea. Now, here's the interesting thing. Yes. Here's the interesting thing that I can't wait to show you, but it has to be in a picture. Remind me of tax cost $200. Yes, the connection's just really bad. Okay. When this does ever show up, you're going to see, here we go, 3 pictures. You remember how I mentioned that all 3 of these guys are Republicans? The Republicans are red. The Democrats are blue. So things have changed over the past 100 years. What does this mean? Well, I don't know if you know, but somewhere between the 1950s and the 2000s, the colors switched. It had to do with the news stations. We'll get into that when that happens in the decade. But the names, the colors, what does this mean? Oh my goodness, I'd love to get into it, but we don't have time with this decade. However, when we are finished with our decades, I want to do an entire class on the history of Democrats and Republicans. Where do the names come from? Where do the colors come from? Why? Yeah, I don't get it. What does this mean? So we'll get to that down the road. Yeah.
What's the yellow?
The yellow, I believe, is a third party, or somebody just dropped some paint on it.
Was it the Boomers party?
I don't know if that even still existed at that point, but you can look it up. Then there's this guy who might look familiar to you. Remember, he was in World War I. He's going to show up again in World War II. He was on the cover of Time magazine, which was already around back then and already thinking it was very important with its Person of the Year. This is 1923. So him being a public figure is going to run through multiple decades. So by the time we get to him being in election, people know who he is. Okay. This one is interesting. I got a few things to tell you about. In 1909, there were more saloons than schools, churches, or libraries in the United States. So that whole, like, we've always been Christian in the good old days, we had such great values, well, this is a problem. In the 20s, there was this big rift in society between the people who wanted progressivism, so you got your flappers, you got your beer picketers, you've got the people who want to be modern and let's move forward and let's do these certain things, and then you had your more traditional side, your more conservative side. These are the ones who were picketing about prohibition and trying to get that in, et cetera, et cetera. So you got two aspects of society, and they don't get along. They're very, very different from one another. So prohibition. If you don't know about prohibition, one big thing about the 20s was that it became law in the United States that alcohol was illegal. Now, I think that's pretty awesome. And some of these other people did too. The people who really wanted prohibition were pushing and pushing for this, and this is one of the kind of political cartoons of the day, saying that the alcohol is the cause of the devastation that, oh goodness, ruined homes and orphans and widows and insanity and divorce and riots and murder. Basically, all the problems of society are based on liquor. And if we can get rid of liquor, we're going to get rid of all these results of sin.
That's a downhill.
Now, the problem is, the only way to truly get rid of sin is Jesus Christ. So just making something illegal doesn't change people into moral and good people. So for a time, it was illegal. There was a big push. People were dumping out big kegs of beer and stuff, and it was a big mess. So there were the votes. Of course, vote dry means vote prohibition. No alcohol. That's what that means. It's not like for deodorant. Okay. I really like this picture. It's got the whiskey and the saloon and the people coming out. The stuff that's pouring out of it are all these drunken, miserable, terrible people. And it's mentioning that the House adopts it. 282 to 128. So that's not bad. So it becomes illegal to have liquor. Well, unfortunately, that backfired. Here's another political cartoon. Prohibition 1920. Yay! All right. It backfired. The speakeasies came into existence, and a speakeasy was a juice joint, basically this hidden underground thing where they played jazz music and they drank illegal liquor and they smoked and they danced, and it was the rise of the mobs and the gangsters and the mafia and just a lot of evil. So basically, it's not that things got better, it's just that they went in the black market. This guy, his name was John Dewey. John Dewey taught high school for a little bit, and he taught elementary school for a little bit, and then he realized that teaching wasn't for him. So I think he went on to college and became a professor and a philosopher. And he did tons of philosophizing about school and education. He was an atheist, he was a Marxist, and he was a humanist. So, an atheist doesn't believe in God. A humanist kind of believes that man is, your own God. Let society raise itself up. And a Marxist, you can study that one on your own. But this is one of the things that he said. There is no God and there is no soul. Hence, there is no need for the props of traditional religion. With dogma and creed excluded, Now, remember, we're talking about education and the schools. Then immutable truth is dead and buried. There is no room for fixed and natural law or permanent moral absolutes. So you can see this is this core foundation of the idea of I can have my truth, you can have your truth. There's no such thing as absolutes. It doesn't matter, how the world got started. Well, you got your theory, I got my theory. We're all happy together as long as you don't tell me that mine's wrong. This guy was in the 20s. This is a long time ago, 100 years ago. He also said, children who know how to think for themselves, what a thought, spoil the harmony of the collective society, which is coming where everyone is interdependent. It takes a village. So in other words, if you think for yourself, you are dangerous. Does that sound familiar? We shouldn't let kids think for themselves. We shouldn't let parents teach kids to think for themselves because they become dangerous to the whole that we are trying to push upon our society. So in other words, we raise up a generation of children totally indoctrinated into what we want them to believe. Don't let them think for themselves, and that's the way to make society the way that you want it, which is true. And that's one of the reasons you're here as homeschoolers. I would imagine if you asked your parents, one of the reasons they're homeschooling you is because they want to teach you to think for yourself. They want to teach you not just to accept everything that's coming at you from your culture, but to filter it through the truth of God's Word, to know what you believe, be able to stand for it, to know how to express it if you're talking to somebody like this. Okay, moving on. Let's do some good, bad, and weird. Good. Louis Armstrong. Louis Armstrong was one of the greatest trumpet players of all time. This is him singing. He had this weird gravelly voice and this fun, big smile. He's an African American, and you can get on YouTube and hear some of his trumpet playing. It's astonishing. I'm going to do some trumpet solo, but maybe later. But I wanted to tell you a story. Did you notice this up here? The Star of David. What's that all about? Well, Louis Armstrong had a really difficult growing up age. His mom was 16 when she had him, I believe, and the dad ran off. And he was super poor, and he ended up getting a job as a young kid working for this Jewish family. And the Jewish family, he spent a lot of time with them, and the family was really good to him, and he noticed they didn't treat him any differently because he was black, which is the way all people should be, but at that time in America, it was not the case. He was in New Orleans, whichever way you want to pronounce it. But he also noticed from spending a lot of time with them the mistreatment of the Jews as being prejudiced against as well because of their race, not because of their color. But he said they would work really hard and they would just move on. And he noticed that for the Jewish families, they kind of their thinking was, it's hard here, but it's way worse in Russia where we came from. And here, we're free. We still have to work really hard, and it's tough, but we're free, and we can work hard, and we can move forward. And so he kind of picked up that attitude of, not just sitting in it, but picking yourself up and let's go, let's do something. And they were the first ones, a Jewish person was the first one to give him a little tin horn, and he started playing on it and discovered he loved it, and he was good at it, and so he just kept getting better. He saved up his money. He was able, I think somebody either helped him or gave him his first, real actual trumpet, and that was his beginning of his success. And so he never forgot the Jewish family, so he would wear a Star of David almost all of his adult life in honor to the Jewish people who were so kind to him.
What did he wear?
I think it was a necklace. Oh. Okay, more good stuff. Now, remember a lot of the medical stuff we've been looking at for the past, we're going to get to that as to being creepy and not so great. But this decade, insulin was discovered. Now, if you don't know about insulin, it's a diabetic person when their sugar drops, they'll die, basically. So at that point, like pneumonia, like a lot of tuberculosis, it was just a death sentence. If you got diabetes, you were going to die. When they discovered this, it meant the diabetics didn't have to die. It's huge. It was awesome. The other thing that was discovered was penicillin, which saved all kinds of lives during the war. If you want to study how that works, you can study how that works. My father's allergic to it, so it doesn't help him. But this was hugely significant. They're discovering new things. People keep trying things. Doesn't always work, but moving forward. No, the bad. Oh, man. Okay. This one. There was a big rise of the KKK during this decade. I remember I told you things are splitting. Oddly enough, from what I studied, this resurgence during the 20s wasn't necessarily about blacks and whites. It was about something else. So if you want to look into it and study it, it's very, very interesting. But it had this big rise up, and then it just kind of died out. But it got up to between like 2 and 5 million people. Spending money and spending on credits. Welcome problems. So Americans have more money, and then this shows up. So basically, like, buy today, pay later, this idea that you don't have to pay right now. This is a totally new thought process, totally new ideal. Instead of saving up until you have enough money and then you get something, you could go home with a car today. And you've all seen the commercials. I don't even need to do it for you. This was a new thing. It's like, oh, that's exciting. That's wonderful. Let's do it. But what happened, by the end of the 20s, more money was spent on advertising, because you're trying to get everybody to buy all your stuff, than was spent on education. Look at the money, and you will see the priorities. 80% of the population has no savings. This is a problem. But again, remember, we're partying, eat, drink, and be merry, for tomorrow we shall die. Well, tomorrow you have the Great Depression. It couldn't last forever on this, crazy train they were on. And if you haven't read this yet, history repeats itself. The number of Americans that are in debt right now is statistically about 80%. So it's about the same as in the 20s. It's now the 20s. We just had a pandemic. Kind of creepy if you think about it. And unfortunately, does that mean we got a Great Depression coming? I don't know. The war. In 1929 was when the stock market crashed. We're going to leave that for the next decade because we're going to talk about the Great Depression and how it got started. But for now, you just knew it was coming. Basically what was happening was this spending and this partying and this don't worry about it, think about it later kind of thing. It's a lot like piling up blocks on top of each other. And it's really exciting. You see a kid, the higher it gets, the more excited they get. But you are watching it thinking, that's coming down, that's coming down. If you put a few more on there, that's coming down. And it came down. And there was still more medical stuff that shouldn't have ever been on the market. Here's some heroin tablets, and if you can't see it, this is by the Bayer Company. As in, they're still around selling us medications. They're the big producers of aspirin. They used to be producers of that. For some reason, they stopped doing it. The Federal Drug and Whatever Act came in the 30s. It wasn't around yet. So there was no law regulating what could be sold over the counter as medicine and what couldn't be sold. So you still were seeing pretty creepy, nasty stuff like arsenic and strychnine, which if you don't know anything about those, both of those are poisons that will kill you. And these are chocolate coated, so you can kill yourself while having fun, I guess, or whatever. Oh, dear me. But it's got reduced iron. I don't know if that's good or not, but yeah. You would have had to come to other classes to know some of that. Better than whiskey for colds and flu. So now we've got cold medicine that's got 10% alcohol. So I don't know if this was legal during Prohibition, but their concept was back then there was kind of this idea if you had a bag cold, you take a swig of whiskey. Why everybody had some around, I'm not sure. But apparently this was better. Yes, Meadow. Yes, ma'am. All right, now we get to go to the beard. Hopefully. Oops. It's mine.
Do you want to know something interesting about China?
Not at the moment because we're running out of time, but you can tell me later. Okay, so we have cigarettes that are recommended by dentists. Again, remember advertising. There were a lot of ads like this about the cigarettes to help your asthma. I have asthma. Yeah, no, that's not going to happen. Your dentist, yeah, that's a great idea. So remember, just because they're advertising it doesn't mean it's good. Just because they say it's good, like the heroin tablets, doesn't mean it's good. So check things out for yourself before you swallow what the advertisers are trying to get you to buy. This is weird. Yeah, that's just weird. We're just going to leave that there. Safe, sanitary, and comfortable. This one, I just absolutely love it. Obesity soap. So if you got too many pounds, use this soap, and somehow it's just going to scrub the fat right off you. Okay. Without dieting or gymnastics, absolutely harmless, never fails to reduce flesh when directions are followed. So if you go to them and say, it didn't work, they're like, you must not have followed directions. Yeah. Okay. So look at that. I mean, look at that picture. You're going to lose all that and all that. Wow. Probably your hair's going to fall out or something. Okay, the last thing, 1920s slang, of which you have heard some. The cat's pajamas. Oh, that's swell. That came from the 1920s. Some of these we still use. Most of them we don't. You're getting all dolled up for something. He's a good egg. That means a rich guy. The heebie-jeebies. Getting the heebie-jeebies. Oh. And how we went to this place and he said this. And how. Oh, my goodness, girl. Yes.
My Nana says all of those.
You should ask your Nana some stories. I bet she has some great ones. All right. Get on the level with me. We still kind of say that. I want you to level with me. That means just be honest. Just tell me straight.
Still say beef.
I got a beef with you. I got a bone to pick with you. What's with the bone? I don't know what's that. The bee's knees. Do bees have knees?
Yeah.
I don't know. Have you ever checked? They kind of bend their legs. Next time you got a bee, you just hang out and figure it out. Scram! Get out of here. A gangster. A stool pigeon. That's somebody who tells on somebody else. I ain't no stool pigeon. If you watch those old gangster movies, I ain't no stool pigeon. I ain't gonna tell anybody. Oh, applesauce. And the cat's meow. She just the cat's meow. So you can go and say a few of those and freak them out. Actually, if you have a grandma, ask her. Have a great grandma, ask her. You never know. Okay. So we're gonna turn the lights back on, and I want to go to your worksheet. Spend a little time talking about it. Look at that. We've got some pictures on the right. These are pictures from that time period. I want you to look at the one on the bottom. The descent of the modernists. Now remember, this is the modern age that's beginning, the progressive age. People want to be forward, forward, forward. But some people didn't think this was a good idea. And one of the things they were trying to point out was, what does this mean? And here's this descent. And it's very interesting. This is like a newspaper political cartoon, and they're talking about what happens. You start up at the top. There's Christianity. The Bible's not infallible. Man is not made in God's image. No miracles. No virgin birth. No deity. No atonement. No resurrection. Agnosticism. And atheism. Have we seen that happen? Wow. They're pretty right on. And if you look above that, there's some of the things of the time. The very top one was the Anti-Evolution League. So I'm sure you're figuring out by now that the Scopes monkey trial had something to do with evolution. Monkeys, you know. And then below it, the attorneys near blows in Evolution Trial Row, and they've got the pictures of some cave dude that doesn't really exist, but he looks pretty impressive. So this was a big deal in our culture at the time. This is the 1920s, and somebody's trying to get evolution into the schools, and people are saying, no, you shouldn't have evolution in the schools. And then here's John Dewey saying that God shouldn't be anywhere near your schools. It was just a big upheaval of time of people kind of wondering what's right, what's wrong, what's good, what's bad. So who are you? And that's the question. When things go into upheaval like they did in the 20s, like they're doing in the 20s, who are you? Where do you stand? If everybody starts laughing at people who believe the Bible, are you going to stand true? Are you going to know how to give an answer for the faith that you have? Or are you going to kind of just be quiet and hope it blows over? Or are you going to just give in and start clapping away and find yourself compromising and regretting it later? That is the question.